Greetings, family. This is Brother Eli with another episode of Bible Truth Revealed. Today I will be tackling the subject, why did Jesus sin? Why did Jesus sin? Now, this is a very important subject because many people do not realize that Jesus actually sinned. So I'm going to start by demonstrating, according to the scriptures, what sin is, then proving that Jesus sinned, and finally I'm going to explain why Jesus sinned. Let's turn to 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. It says, "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law. For sin is the transgression of the law. Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law. For sin is the transgression of the law." So whoever transgresses or breaks the law of God has committed sin. So I'm going to go to Jeremiah chapter 17 in the Septuagint, verses 21 to 23. Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 to 23. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I choose to use the Septuagint because it is the oldest, most reliable Bible I could get my hands on. It was translated from Hebrew, the original Hebrew, into Greek by the Israelites back in the year 250 BC. And today it's available in English and as well in Greek. Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 to 23. "Thus says the Lord, take heed to your souls, and take up no burdens on the Sabbath day, and go not forth through the gates of Jerusalem." Verse 22. "And carry forth no burdens out of your houses on the Sabbath day, and ye shall do no work. Sanctify the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers." Verse 23. "But they hearkened not, and inclined not their ear, but stiffened their neck more than their fathers did, so as not to hear me, and not to receive correction." So God said, do not take up a burden on the Sabbath day. Verse 22 again, "And carry forth no burdens out of your houses on the Sabbath day, and ye shall do no work. Sanctify the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers." We're not supposed to do any manner of work on the Sabbath day. Verse 23, "But they hearkened not," which means that they rejected the commandments of God. They refused to keep the commandments of God and inclined not their ear. They had no interest in what God had to say on the subject, but stiffened their neck more than their fathers did, so as not to hear me and not to receive correction. So this is God's commandment, and if I can demonstrate that Jesus broke that commandment, then I would have proven that Jesus sinned. And after proving that Jesus sinned, I'm going to address why Jesus sinned. Because I imagine the first thing a person would think once they accept that Jesus sinned is he must have had a good reason for doing it. So why is very important. Let us turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 5. John, chapter 5, I will read verses 1 to 11, then verses 16 to 18, because that is where the points are. But feel free to read the entire chapter in order to make sure you get the full story. I am reading from the King James Version of the New Testament. John chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Verse 2. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Verse 3. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. Verse 4, for an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. 5, and a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie, and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? Verse 7. The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Verse 8. Jesus says unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. Verse 9, and immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked, and on the same day was the Sabbath. Now it's important to notice the reason it says that on the same day was the Sabbath is because there was that law that one was not supposed to carry a load on the Sabbath. Verse 10 makes it very clear. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. Now notice that these Jews were correct, because we just read in Jeremiah chapter 17 that it is not lawful to carry a burden on the Sabbath day. Yet this man has just been told to do the very same thing by Jesus when he healed him. So verse 10 again, the Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. Verse 11, he answered them, He that made me whole, the same said unto me, Take up thy bed and walk. Now verse 16 says, And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. The punishment for breaking the Sabbath day was death, and this is the reason the Jews wanted to slay Jesus, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Not only had he worked on the Sabbath day, but he commanded someone else to work, in direct contradiction to what we read in Jeremiah chapter 17, and what is written elsewhere in the Holy Scriptures. Verse 17, but Jesus answered them, My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Now notice, Jesus did not say, there's a good explanation for this. He did not deny that he worked on the Sabbath. In fact, he confirmed it. He said, My Father is working, and I am working, although it is the Sabbath day. Now, if sin is breaking God's law, and God's law says, do not work on the Sabbath day, and Jesus has been found to be working on the Sabbath day and encouraging someone to carry a load which they should not have been carrying on the Sabbath day, then Jesus indeed broke the law Jesus indeed sinned. Now, verse 18 says this. Just so you can see this is not my private interpretation. Verse 18 says, therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So notice, Jesus broke the Sabbath, and he did not pretend that he did not break the Sabbath, but he simply said, my Father is working today on the Sabbath. That's what hitherto mean, even at this point, and I work today, hitherto, at this point, on the Sabbath. And the Jews wanted to kill him even more because he had broken the Sabbath. By breaking the Sabbath, he broke God's law, which means he was in transgression. He sinned. So the question now is, why did Jesus sin? And the answer is simple, whilst difficult to accept. Jesus sinned because the pagans who invented him wrote the New Testament to undermine God's law. The pagans who invented the Jesus character wrote the New Testament in an effort to undermine God's law, and they got that person of Jesus whom they invented to break God's law and to admit that he broke God's law, and to even accuse God of breaking his own law by saying, my Father is working and I am also working on the Sabbath day. And because Jesus himself sinned, according to Christian doctrine, he could not have qualified to die for anybody else's sin. So the children of Israel need to wake up to the fact that we have been deceived. Jesus never existed, and it's time for us to return to the Father. With that, I say, Shalom.